All right, so this module is just going to be mostly wrap up from the last couple of weeks, and then we're going to dedicate a big chunk of time to hackathon prep, helping people get teamed and figuring out kind of what we're looking at going into tomorrow. So again, this session, like all the sessions, is going to be recorded and distributed, as well as concurrently live streamed on YouTube. And again, just one final reminder, if you have not joined the Slack channel yet, please do so as soon as possible so you can use it to communicate with your hackathon group over the weekend. So I don't have too much planned here, except for a thank you to everybody who has stuck it out so far. We know that for a lot of you, it was probably a very grueling 2 weeks, but we really appreciate that you've followed us all the way through here. I want to just recognize that level of commitment, and we're looking forward to working with some of you over the weekend on your personal projects. So this session officially concludes the workshop portion of the 2023 CompuCell 3D workshop. And then, like I've been saying, we will begin the hackathon tomorrow morning. But we're going to go ahead and have some time for Q&A and feedback now. And then we'll do about, I guess, roughly about an hour of hackathon teaming and additional project discussion. So we would like to just go ahead and open the floor to anyone who has any questions about anything that we've gone over so far, anything that they would like maybe further support about or further reading, or if you have feedback about anything that we've covered for the past week, maybe things that we didn't get to that you would like to see more of. We'll go ahead and open the floor for feedback now, and we'll leave the floor open for about the next 15 to 20 minutes. I think everybody should have unmute privileges at this point. Yeah, James is pointing out suggestions for topics to add next year or to leave out. Bug reports, things that you found difficult about using or setting up CompuCell. Basically, any thoughts or feedback people may have.
There's a question, which is, what is the energy that's displayed at the bottom of the player in CompuCell, saying what the energy is? And can you see how much energy is due to volume constraint and how much is due to adhesion? That's a little bit of a tricky question, because the energy is not really a self-consistent thing. We're really evaluating the forces at each time. And so each time that there's a change of configuration in the cell lattice, we calculate an energy change. And so those energy changes are summed up. And so what you're seeing at the bottom is the sum of all of those individual voxel copy changes. Now, it's not always obvious that that quote energy makes sense, but that's what's at the bottom. Now, the question about how much of the energy is due to volume constraint and how much is due to adhesion is an interesting one. I believe for a long time you couldn't do that. And there were requests specifically to do this, and I would need to dig a little bit. But I believe there is actually a demo. One thing that we did not do much, which we should probably do next year, is actually walk through all of the demos. As you know, CompuCell comes packaged with a bunch of demos. They're not organized very well. There's no place that says what they do. And so it's a bit of an issue, but I believe there is a demo that actually shows you the energies as a function of the different the different energy functionals. Let me take a quick look and see if I can find that. Some of the things that TJ was talking about today are included in the demos. So there's a lot of hidden information in those demos that probably needs to see the light of day. If somebody has wanted to be generous, a good hackathon project might be actually walking through the demos and saying what they do. So if you go to demos, there is under demos, CompuCell, Python tutorial, energy report. There is a demo that will show you the energies of each of the components as the simulation runs. And if we look at the Python steppables, let's see how this is being done. So it actually returns, so the values of each update are returned. Vol underscore E at H underscore E tote underscore E. And then these are histogrammed here. Now, so there's a function self.get energy calculations that will do this for you. And I have to say that I have never tried using it, so I would suggest exploring that. There should be in the Python manuals, there should be a documentation on the functionality of that function, that get energy calculation function. Let's just look at the XML to see whether you have to turn on any specific. Yes, there is. Under the pots block of the XML, you have to turn on energy function calculator. So that's there. So that's the kind of thing. Tomorrow, if you have Maciek's ear, I would recommend asking him specifically about that.
Can you go back to the steppables real quick? I'm trying to find if where does he get the specific, for example, volume energy? Where is it being accessed?
So I believe what's happening is when you turn on that function in the XML, then every time it does a lattice update, it keeps track of what the energy was, because it also has rejected. It also has accepted versus rejected energy changes. So each time it tries to do an update, each microstep of the simulation, where it picks a lattice site, tries to move the boundary of a cell, and then determines the energy change, it's returning all of that.
Mm-hmm. So I can, for example, in the foam simulation, if I want to know the pressure inside the bubble or the pressure difference between two bubbles in an interface, I can switch pixel states, measure the energy using this plugin, and do this repeatedly, so I can calculate the probability of that specific copy to happen.
That would be an amazingly inefficient way to do it, but it would work, yes.
Yeah, but what would be a better one?
What are you? Well, let's see whether this answers the question from our that was asked in the chat before we go on. So and I apologize for not having the details on that one. As I say, I knew that functionality existed, but I've never used it. I do know it's going to be exceedingly slow. If you're on 1,000 by 1,000 lattice, you have 1 million update attempts per Monte Carlo step. And so it's going to call that function and return those values 1 million times in one Monte Carlo step. So it's not something that you want to do during a normal run. It's something that's going to be very slow. Now,
No, thanks. it answers my question, because the main thing I wanted to know is whether, for example, all my pixel copies are due to the adhesion term and that the volume doesn't do anything. And that's something you can check like once right now, just to
So-
get a feeling.
So the way I would do that, I would tend to do that in a maybe a less intelligent way, which is I would turn the lambdas up and down and see what the frequency of update of acceptances is. Right, you turn off. So if you think all of your bias is due to volume calculation, then if you turn off the volume, turn off everything else, nothing should change. But you're right, because in these effective energies, if you want them to be meaningful, the delta H's for each term have to be roughly comparable. And so you do want to know what those are. Of course, those might change as the configuration changes. And so, yes, absolutely. The whole point of this simulation, let's see the running of it. The running of it is it's actually giving you a histogram of all of the energy, the delta H's for each term. And so, yes, so this is extremely useful if you want to calibrate, to pick the energy scales in your model. Yes, absolutely. Something that you want to do. Right, so it's here, it's got on this plot here on this top right, you've got average energy change by function. So that's exactly
Really
what you want.
fast. Extremely fast simulation.
Well, I guess it's not, it's having, you're pointing out that I said it would slow things down a lot. It's doing the calculation, let me put it this way, it has to do this calculation anyway. So the only thing that would be taking time is returning the values from C++ where they're available. They have to be available to do the actual updates to the Python layer and then pulling them out. So it's a question of how fast Swig is, because the wrapping is done with Swig. But that was a great question, and that's actually something that this is something actually perhaps that we should. Maybe Hayden, you could make a note. This is something that Giulio could show in that second lecture where he talks about how CompuCell works and the energy functionals. The fact that we need to make sure that the energy terms, delta H's for each energy term are roughly comparable. And then we could actually run this demo to show how to get that information. It's a little technical for people who aren't physicists. So I tend to shy away from that, but actually it's quite an interesting question. All right. So then there was another question, which was Giulio asked, how trustworthy are the random number generators? So one of the things that you would discover if you actually write a Potts algorithm is that the Potts algorithm is one of the best tests of the quality of a random number generator you're ever going to run into. And so, for example, if you just used C++ RND function or Python RND function by itself, you would discover that the evolution of the lattice would be a mess because of correlations in the random numbers. And so we use a pretty good random number generator inside of CompuCell. You might imagine nowadays some CPUs actually have a hardware random number generator, a true random number generator, rather than a pseudo random number generator. The difficulty of that is then you can never reproduce a run. If you use a true hardware random number generator, you can't generate the same sequence a second time. So that's a trade-off, and they tend to be a bit slow, a little surprisingly, perhaps those hardware random number generators, true random number generators, are a bit slow. You can approximate that if you're worried about it by pulling from the time, the last few digits of the time in nanoseconds. And then using that to seed your random number generator every so often. That gives you effectively a true random number generator. But the random number generators have to be good, or you would see the cells would move in particular directions, or you'd see patterning in the lattice that you wouldn't. It's quite obvious when the random numbers aren't right. Okay. Yeah, so the comment here about the random numbers being, again, the issue is not the uniformity of random number generators, although one of the things that happens occasionally, both the Python and the C++ random number generators, they're not supposed to ever return 0, but they do occasionally. So again, we don't use the internal random number generators. We use a better one. Somebody says, could you come back to a future workshop? You would be delighted to. You are welcome to come back to a future workshop. Many times people do come back. One of the reasons we did 2 weeks this year was because people last year said they wanted more time to digest things, and because they said they wanted to go into more detail. I've learned a couple of things, that it really, learning CompuCell takes more than a week. I rather regret that we put the Python bootcamp on day 0 on Monday instead of Sunday as traditional. I think we should have had 5 days for the introductory section. We needed it. And by all means, come back. And also, if you're welcome to come back, and if you're willing to be a teaching assistant for part of it, you could be a TA and help out teaching for the part you know well, and then you can learn the rest. The other possibility in a future year would be to really break this apart, have a 1-week introductory course, and then completely separately have a 1-week advanced course. We didn't know how many people would show up if we did that, which is why we didn't do it that way this year. And I would love to have a developers workshop, but I'm not the one who'd teach that. I'm a modeler. I developed the methodology 30 years ago, and I wrote, actually, some of my algorithms are still used inside of CompuCell, but the actual coding of CompuCell is not my work. It's Maciek, TJ, Andy Samoji, Randy Highland, and some others did most of the core code in CompuCell. Again, everybody is welcome to come back. We appreciate it. And on the scheduling, I apologize. There is no way of scheduling this that works for everybody. If we start earlier in the morning, then people on the West Coast of the United States can't do it conveniently. If we start later in Europe, it's not convenient. No matter what time we do it, if you're in Asia, it's bad. And the comment about breaks is also a good one. Some of the earlier, we had longer days with longer breaks. But then, especially for the Europeans, it gets very late. And so that's one of the reasons we record everything. The recordings aren't perfect, but at least you have that material available. Anybody who wants to help us, we really want to write a textbook. We keep talking about anybody who wants to help us create exercises, write textbook, identify things that need to be written about. Want to be a co-author in a textbook, it's a great opportunity. Okay, now, Pedro, I cut you off, I think, on your question. You were asking about how to calculate pressures. In what situation?
Let me give you a more practical example. So let's say I'm trying to calculate the stress tensor and I only have a particular lattice configuration. One way I can calculate force over cells, even though I'm not using external potential plugin. So for example, let's say I have a tissue and then I, for example, stretch it a little bit, and then I release, and I look at a particular site in this tissue, very small site, a differential site in the tissue. So in the boundaries of this differential site, to calculate the force in these boundaries, I would calculate the energy differences in pixel copy between the two sides of the boundary to estimate the probability flux of the copy, and this is proportional to the force acting over the interface.
Oh, Fatima says sign them up for helping to write manuals. That would be fantastic. Please, don't lose that thread, please.
Yes, I have to grab Fatima email. So
If
please.
nothing else, walking through the demos and having a description of each demo. We've started that project many times and it never happens. So you only really have to calculate. You don't have to go forward and backward, because you always know the reverse is undoing what you did. So the force is, well, you only need to calculate the energy, displacement energy in one direction. Of course, if you go in the forward direction where the energy goes down, you don't gain any information. Now, but what is the purpose? What do you want to do with that? So for example, you said pressure. If you have a volume energy, you know the pressure immediately, because the pressure is just the difference between the actual and the target volume. So you're talking about a situation in which there is no pressure, where there is no volume constraint.
Well, either if there is no volume constraint or there is volume constraint, but I'm not in the steady state. Because if I'm not in the steady state, the pressure given by the V minus V target doesn't work.
No, it's still the pressure. That is the definition of the pressure. Now, if you're doing a foam simulation where there is no volume energy, then there's a flux of material across the boundary, and that behaves as if it were a pressure. But it's actually not simulating a foam. In that case, it's simulating a metal, and there is no actual pressure. It's a curvature energy. What you're calculating there is curvature energy. So that's a bit technical, but there's no, if there's no the volume, one of the things we didn't talk about, although there was an example we tried where actually yesterday when we tried something where Hayden turned on the multi-threading. Has anybody tried turning on multiple processors while we've been doing this on any of the demos? The one that Hayden tried happened to be one where it didn't work very well. So one of the things that one wants to think about, and I've talked about asking the question biologically, asking the question, what information is available to a cell? How is information transmitted or propagated through a physical system? As I always am saying, cells have information about their local state and their internal state. They don't know that they're in a given position in an organism. They only know what their local state is. On the other hand, there's information that's transmitted by forces, by flow, by chemical diffusion, that can take information from one place to another, give long-range information. But nevertheless, it can only be received locally. There isn't an equivalent vision for cells. They can't see. The same thing comes up a little bit in the physics of the system. So the Potts lattice is a lattice. And so interactions only happen on the scale of the movement of single voxels. That's why that interaction range is important, and you keep setting interaction ranges. However, an energy functional like the volume constraint transmits information across the whole size of the cell. Because if one voxel changes anywhere in the cell, the volume changes throughout the volume of the cell. And therefore, the energy information is transmitted instantaneously from any position on the surface of the cell to any other. And so you get long-range transmission of information when the volume constraint's turned on. Surface constraint the same way. If you don't have a volume constraint, and you're doing a foam simulation, it's really, as I say, a metal grain simulation, there is no longer any long-range transmission of information. Pressure sends information at the speed of sound through a material fast. And we assume when we do thermodynamics, usually that pressure is instantaneously the same everywhere in a domain, unless we're doing sound. And so in that case, we don't have an equivalent of pressure. There is no pressure in a domain. There's an equivalent of pressure, which is given by the difference, as you say, what you were trying to do, where you're trying to infer the effective pressure in a domain from the rate of transmission of material across the boundary because of Fick's law. But in a true foam simulation, there is actually no pressure inside of a domain because there's no transmission of information. It's a subtle point, but an important one. And that came up at the very beginning when all these methods were being developed 35 years ago. Really, it's a matter of concern.
Yeah, so if I want to calculate the force over a cell boundary, for example, I have to calculate the energy difference between copy attempts.
Well, so sure, but I guess the question is, what do you want to do with that information?
For example, calculate the stress tensor.
Stress tensor. You mean the stress tensor on the cell itself?
No, in a large tissue, you look at a small site of this large tissue. So you have supposedly infinite cells inside the small site and infinite sites in the tissue. And then you stretch the tissue, for example, release, and you see how the stress tensor behaves in time.
Yeah, that one we probably need a blackboard or a whiteboard to talk it over, because the issue there is that the way you define stress and strain is going to give you very different answers. Right. If this is again rather technical, but if I have a continuous elastic material like a rubber band, and I pull on it, as long as I don't deform it too much, the force that it applies back against my pulling is proportional to the amount that I've stretched it. It behaves like an ideal spring, which means it has a Young's modulus, which is the spring constant K. Now, that's a macroscopic result. If I looked at each of the polymers in the rubber, the force would be rather different. They're not aligned with the they're not aligned with the material as a whole. And so there are a whole bunch of different stresses and strains that can be computed on materials. The simple one is the bulk stress and strain. Microscopically, it's a more complicated question. Even getting the bulk ones we didn't do. It's something I'd hoped we'd do this year. Is to create a domain which has links triangulating it, pull on it, and plot the force versus the elongation of the domain. That's a nice problem to do as a demo. Yeah,
I wanted to. This was actually one of my projects in the viscoelasticity class back in URGS, to calculate these coefficients, for example, Poisson rate, bulk modulus, etc. And in CompuCell, because that's the difference between the simulation and the experiment. In the experiment, you can calculate the for example, these modulus and ratios, but you cannot measure the stress tensor in a particular point in the tissue. That's too challenging for an experiment. So you could try to infer cellular and intercellular dynamics, and by dynamics I mean force, with the simulation. When you match the coefficients you measure, both in simulation and experiments. I'm not sure if I'm clear.
So I think I understand what you're trying to say, and again, this is probably too technical for maybe for the people in the room at Friday afternoon, but it's a good topic of conversation. An example of this would be the concept of viscosity. So when you have a simple fluid, a Newtonian fluid, there's a number associated with it, which would be the viscosity or the kinematic viscosity sometimes. And that says that if you have an object moving through the fluid, there's a drag, or if you have shear in the fluid, there's a drag associated with shear in the fluid. We tend to use that number and assume that fluids have a viscosity. If a fluid is not an ideal fluid, then that viscosity at the minimum depends on other things like the shear, the energy dissipation is not linearly proportional to the shear. It may be proportional to the shear squared or something else. But if there's a structure in the fluid, at the scale of that structure, the viscosity is no longer defined at all. And in biology in particular, if I have a bulk fluid, a bulk material, and I apply some force to it, I can measure the energy dissipation at a bulk level. But if I now try to go to smaller and smaller scales and I try to measure the equivalent of the viscosity at different scales, I get totally different numbers. And so there are beautiful experiments that were done in France a long time ago using what are called magnetic tweezers, where you take a tiny particle, really tiny, like 1/10 of a micron or 1 micron particle. You put it in a tissue, you apply a magnetic field to it, and you measure how fast it moves, or how far it moves if it stops, as a function of the force applied. You can calibrate the force. And what you'll find is depending on exactly where you put that little particle and how fast you move it, and how big it is, you get totally different estimates of the viscosity. Really by orders of magnitude, many orders of magnitude. And so fundamentally what it's telling you is that there isn't really a viscosity that makes sense at a micro level, even though macroscopically you're doing work on the system and you're dissipating. And so there is a macroscopic viscosity. Mm-hmm. And so the stress and the strain are not so simple. Stress and strain are both basically macroscopic concepts. And when there's microscopic texture, it doesn't necessarily make sense to talk about stress and strain. As you point out, there's always a force. There's always a local force in a response. So what you can do is you can, for example, at the cell level, I have my tissue. I equilibrate it. I now apply an explicit force to a single cell in the tissue, and I measure how fast the cell moves and how far it moves. And that gives me then a local stress and strain relationship for that one cell in that tissue. And I can do that repeatedly. As you point out, it's a little harder to do it on the boundary of a cell, but you're right. You can force a spin, a lattice update, a lattice copy, measure the energy change, and that will in fact return the information you want. So I didn't mean to say that wasn't right. I was just trying to understand the context of why you were asking the question, because stress and strain per se will depend, that are not really concepts that are singularly defined. You have to ask them in a context.
So the final objective, just to be clear, because I was remembering the problem at the same time we were discussing.
Sorry, Hayden says that we've overrun our time for general conversation. We need to talk about the hackathon.
Okay.
So I'm
Yeah, is this quick, Pedro, or is it going to spin off into another?
afraid
No,
that
it's just the general idea is to find the right rheological diagram in a particular tissue using a simulation. And that's it. That's the objective.
so that's a hard problem. That's genuinely a hard problem. And CompuCell may not be the best way to do it, because on a lattice, you have fundamentally dissipation for movement against the lattice, which is not present in a real tissue. Rigid body movement can be done in CompuCell, but it's not a strength of CompuCell.
Mm-hmm.
Off-lattice methods work better for that. Okay, sorry about that. I didn't mean to take up all your afternoon. Hayden, you should have interrupted sooner and said that we had to
Oh,
go.
that's okay.
Oh,
We
there's some,
actually have a follow-up question about that, so we can go ahead and answer this in the chat. Yeah, I didn't want to rush the conversation, but I do want to make sure people have at least a few minutes with us to discuss hackathon teaming. We have some questions about that lingering in the ether.
so with things like links, so the question is, can we measure the force that cells exert on other cells with links? And of course, the answer is, if you have links, yes, you know what the forces are, because the force in the link is the difference between the target length and the actual length times the lambda link. And so in the case of a link, you know explicitly what the local stress is. So anytime you have a link, you know what the local stress from that link is. And then you sum up all the links on the cell. That tells you what the link forces are. And so, yes, so in that case, you can actually do that. And that's an experiment. I actually had a very good Brazilian postdoc many years ago where we did this experiment. In chicken embryos. So you take a glass micropipette, the kind you use for neuroscience, and then you can put that glass micropipette in water and you move it at constant speed and it bends. And so, you know, for the size of the pipette, you can calculate what the force is for a given velocity in water. And so you can get the bending modulus of the micropipette. You have to do that each time because each pipette's slightly different. I can now stick that micropipette into a chicken embryo. They're flat. I can pull on it and measure how much it bends and how much the chicken embryo deforms. And that gives me the local stress and the local strain in that embryo. Now it winds up that actually backing out the Young's modulus and the Poisson ratio from that is ill-posed problem. So you have to make certain additional assumptions, but you can actually get an approximation for the Young's modulus of different tissues on the scale of the cells by doing that experiment. So that's actually something that you can do. I wish we'd done more of that. There was a beautiful apparatus that he built, and we wanted to tie it in with CompuCell simulations. We never did that. It's an old paper. It would be worth somebody going back. I think other groups have now done that better methodology. But again, it depends on the size of the probe you use. If you use a big probe, you get a different result from a micropipette. And if you use a nanoparticle, you get a different result. There is no consistent Young's modulus for living organisms. Depends on the scale. Okay, Hayden, back to you.
All right. If there aren't any more questions, I think what we'll do next for the next 40 minutes or so is have a little bit more time for hackathon project discussion. I know we have a few people that are still looking for groups. Let me take a look at the shared document here. All right, let me All right, so currently we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 project ideas in the shared document. It's a pretty good start, especially given the size of the group currently. So let's start this way. Does anybody have any specific questions for specific members of the instructional team that are here today about their projects? So I know Fatima and I have actually been talking a little bit, James, on the side. She may be interested in doing some Morpheus replication during the hackathon. If there's not another group doing.
That would be great. Figuring out how to go between Morpheus and CompuCell is important, and vice versa. It would be nice if Giuliano could be around for that, because he's the one who's thought about that the most to help.
Hi, James. My questions was basically that it's a working project in Morpheus. I wanted to see if it's actually a good thing to work on for the hackathon. I will attach the paper link here. So if you could take a look, that would be great.
In the meantime, anybody else who has specific questions for the instructional team, please do put them in the chat. Or if you would like a breakout room for your group to go discuss, if you already have a group or people that you're planning on working with, we can open those up if you don't have specific questions right now. Sharon says she has a specific question about adhesion flex. Is there any way to change K from Python? Not sure if somebody else has the context for that.
Okay, sorry, before I get back to that, I didn't want to break your screen share. So Fatima, so there is a paper that does the same thing using CompuCell.
Oh,
It's the
I
paper
didn't know.
presented. It actually does it in a lot more detail than that one. And that's they presented last year. That's Bhattacharya from Michigan State.
Okay.
Hayden, maybe share that and so why don't you watch the video of their did we have a recording of that, or did we not record that one last year?
Talking about Sudin?
Yes.
I don't think Sudin was able to make it. He had something come up at the last minute
Okay.
last year. He was scheduled to present, and then we weren't able to do that.
But the paper is published.
Yes.
So there is a paper using CompuCell on that, on liver zonation and toxicity. So absolutely, if you have especially if you could get access to that code.
I already have it and I checked it's running. So.
Oh, Sudin's code you have.
Oh, no. Okay. That one. Yeah.
But yes, I mean, certainly replicating that model would be very practical in CompuCell. Whether you could get it, it's a complicated model, so whether you could do it in 2 days, I don't know, but you could make a good startup.
Okay.
And of course, we've got our own acetaminophen toxicity model. So if you ask Jim Sluka, of course, he's done a lot of that. So that's a great project.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I can track down that paper for you, Fatima, and send it over.
And on our end, we should download the paper that we just had shared with us and put that on our list of papers to replicate, because it's a good choice.
Yeah, I've got a copy of it here. Any other questions specifically about hackathon projects? Who is still looking for a group of the people that we have in the meeting currently?
I don't have a group, but I was thinking perhaps I should just work on my own during that time. If that's okay. I'd love to work with a group. I just don't know if I could sustain the time frame with my toddler over the weekend.
Were there any of the projects that were of interest to you so far? Or is what you're planning on doing too different?
Well, what I was thinking about doing was just a really simple model with some monocytes that differentiate into pro and anti-inflammatory macrophages with some cytokines, and just starting there and tying that to student wet lab experiments in a petri dish, and like something that students could do, like summer research students. And that seems fairly simple. But I'm also interested in really working on anything that involves modeling at the cellular level or using tellurium or anything, sorry, or anything like that I'm interested in.
Well, I think the idea of doing some inflammation and immune response models would be great. I know Peter, of course, is interested in immune response modeling. I don't know whether the two of you can talk and find something that would be of joint interest. I don't think Josh and Giuliano are going to be very available this weekend, unfortunately. If they were, they've both done quite a bit of that. And I know TJ, unfortunately, is moving this weekend, so he's stuck. The timing is bad for us. But we definitely can try to support you on that. I think, again, if you had your example of having an OD or a population level model of type 1, type 2 macrophages and neutrophils and their interactions, I think is great. And this is a topic of current research interest. There was somebody who took the course 2 years ago at the NIH. We've continued to work with, who's modeling Leishmania, a parasitic infection. And that's an interesting one because in that case, the parasite itself does not cause the problem. What causes the problem is that your immune cells swallow the parasite. The parasite replicates inside of the immune cells. The immune cells then the parasite's not motile. The parasite's then carried by the immune cells throughout your body, where the immune cells then burst and cause damage. And so actually, if you didn't have an immune response to the parasite, there'd be no problem. The entire pathology of the illness is caused by your immune response, not by the parasite. For our Brazilian friends, that's a parasite that shows up in Brazil. That's carried by sandflies. So
that sounds really interesting.
That's another Josh. There were quite a few Joshes involved in this project over the years of one sort or another. So I think that there are a lot of great problems, but to begin with, I think start with one. I think we talked a little bit about maybe just starting with modeling the macrophages and the neutrophils, and sort of systematically doing that. I don't know if other people are interested. Happy to.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. If anyone else is interested in doing inflammatory response modeling, that'd be great. Otherwise, I'll just work on it during the hackathon on my own. I can get some help. Sorry.
I mean, I'll be there, not 100% of the time, but 90% of the time, both days. And I'll try to sort of break my time up into half-hour blocks and circulate and be available to people. Joel probably can help out with that too. He's got a pretty good handle on immune response modeling.
All right, who else is still looking for a group? I think, is everybody in here currently in a group or planning on working on a project already they have an idea for? You can give us a thumbs up if you're set. I think I've talked to most people that are still here at this point.
Does thumbs up mean you do or do not have a project?
You
Maybe-
do.
Okay, so, but because there was a question, Pedro asked in the chat, who does not have a project? At the same time, you said verbally who does.
Yeah.
So
So
we
let's
had,
try again. Thumbs up if you do have a project, thumbs down if you are still looking for a group.
I mean, really, our goal is to try to help you and to try to build groups. It's not that you can't work on your own, but our experience is that as a learning process, if you can team up, it often works better. But it's not we're not. This isn't a university course. This is something which exists purely to help you. So if working individually. So we have a, don't we? I hear you, Marcella. It's I mean, last year we had a group which had somebody in 2 people in India, 1 person in Australia, and 1 person in the Netherlands. Right, so there was no time zone that worked for them. People mentioned Morpheus, so we when we were writing that paper that TJ presented on infection and immune response, that paper had participants in Germany from the Morpheus group and from Australia from the Chaste modeling community, and so you try to get Melbourne, Dresden, and Indiana on the one Zoom call. It wound up that late night for us was the only time we had to be late and not either very early in the morning for us or very late at night were the only 2 times that worked. So we had a lot of 5 a.m. phone calls for that. Okay.
Yeah, and there will, for people who are interested in working on their own project, the main session will be open, so feel free to work with others on your own project if you have questions along the way. Chances are somebody else may be having the same issue, so you can certainly help each other. Working on your individual code too, it doesn't necessarily have to be a group effort or nothing, but do keep in mind if you are going to be working on your own, you may want to spend a little bit of extra time trying to scale the project down on just a little bit, since there will be, a lot of work to do. Like James was saying, you may want to start with something relatively simple that you can develop a working prototype of in a couple of days, and then we can help you after the hackathon over time add more complexity to it if it's something that that you would like to pursue in the future. The point of the hackathon is to help people get a start on either a project that is important to them or their research, and also to just kind of help solidify some of the learning that we've done the past 2 weeks, because you'll have a chance to actually do some of your own model building, on a problem that you are interested in. What do you think, James? Should we take the next? Should we do breakout rooms? I think people are probably tired at this point.
I mean, I guess there's a question. Does anybody want to talk? Who's left? Me, Hayden, Pedro, Joel, and I are here. Gilberto are here. So
I'm willing to discuss.
So we have several of us here to talk if anybody would like, but if people would like to go and Julio was in the call. Julio, you left. He was here and he left. I didn't see that Julio had joined us. Julio actually could, if Julio's available, he has really great expertise in a lot of these issues. The stress strain material, the stress strain, microscopic stress strain, Julio's an expert. He's one of the world's experts on this problem. So you want to understand how to calculate local stress strain. That's something to do. Another thing you might look at, again, I shared that paper of Stan Murray's, where he did some very nice, simple demos of how to calculate energy functionals. Those could be replicated in CompuCell's demonstrations, would be interesting. Okay.
All right, so people will be interested in 20 minutes of breakout room time to talk about projects. Or would people prefer 20 minutes to not have to think about their project before having to think about it very hard for the next 2 days?
Yes, Kieran, please get some rest. I know it's very late for you. Many people, it's late. Thank you very much for participating. Okay, it sounds like I'm not seeing a lot of demand for specifics at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So please get some rest if you're ready. I'll stay in the room if people have additional questions for the next 10 minutes or so. If there are no questions, we'll stop.
Well, Sharon did have one that we can loop back around to about the Adhesion Flex plugin, but we'll let other people go first. So if there's no further questions, we'll see many of you tomorrow, I believe. Yes, and please take the rest of the evening off. And we will see everybody tomorrow. Thank you again for coming today. Yeah, Jim, Sharon was asking about the Adhesion Flex plugin. There's a way to change the K from Python.
There should be, yes. Any parameters that are set in the XML are steerable from Python. Is there a problem? I mean, did you try to do it and it didn't work?
So Karine, if I'm pronouncing her name right, is the one who figured this out during the session. She tried and she showed the drop down in Twedit, and it only shows let's see here.
Maybe screen share so we can see what you're talking.
Get molecule and set molecule, or get molecule density and set molecule density, and different ways of doing that is all that's in there.
Well, there are plenty of things that CompuCell does that are not in Twedit. So
it might be in the documentation.
If you know the one that should be there that's missing, by all means, bring it up with Maciek tomorrow and put in a pull request.
I sent a message to Maciek asking for that changing of the binding energy.
But I'm pretty sure that
we don't know the command. No?
We had this discussion before, right, James? You and me, when I was doing that other new stromal thing, and the discussion was that the binding energy the change of the binding energy doesn't seem to be meaningful in this case, biologically meaningful, because what we're trying to say is that the production of a specific adherent molecule is what controls the binding.
Well, but I guess there are two questions here, which maybe I should listen more. I'm tired, pretty tired myself, so maybe I'm not listening well, Sharon. Which is what maybe you've heard me say this many times already. Why do you want to change the binding energy?
Well, I haven't really given much practice with this module yet, but I assumed in my case, I can't speak for Quirine, that it might be something that would be different from, well, so let's see, it's particular to, it's not about cells, it's about molecules. So it's two particular molecules.
It's a property.
Yeah, maybe not, because that's not evolvable for me.
Right. I mean, it's true that if you want to do a parameter scan, you might change that value, because you might say, imagine, suppose at different pHs the binding is different, or different temperatures the binding is different. But in general, the cell, once you have two molecules, they bind with some affinity. The affinity of the binding is not something the cell has any control over. It's not a local property to the cell.
True. Although cells can invent new molecules, and that's kind of hard to simulate because you have to specify your molecules in advance, I guess.
That's right. That can't be done. But this is a problem with all computation, which is serendipity is difficult.
Yeah.
My example is always the same. If I bring two cells next to each other in a petri dish, they will do something. If I bring two cells that I have written computationally, which have different APIs, and bring them together in a computer, the computer program will crash. Because ultimately all of the interactions that you're going to allow a computational agent to have must be predefined. You can define universes where you say that if I don't know what to do in a given circumstance, I do this. So you have defaults, but that has to be built into the universe. That's what I say. You don't get anything for free in a simulation. I really mean it, and that's a big place. But this is a problem with evolutionary simulations in general, that serendipity is very difficult. Serendipity at different length scales, but particular molecules have particular interesting behaviors. But that's not something that you can calculate looking at the atomic configuration of the molecules. Maybe they're particular domains that are associated with particular functions. But why is hemoglobin what it is?
Right.
There's some accident, or why does the zinc finger binding domain work? There are sometimes accidents that happen.
Right.
The zinc finger just happens to correspond to the spiral periodicity in DNA. But it's an accident. It's not something that could be predicted.
Right.
Yeah, this evolutionary problem you're trying to solve is very tricky. Is that thing I was mentioning to you is almost like a video game. You have to define all the possible rules before you do anything. And then you can play like, oh yes, there is this set of randomness that can move these characters in these directions, but you have to have the rules predefined.
That's why playing with control is easier in evolutionary simulations. In other words, you say these are the signals, the input signals that are possible. These are the output behaviors I have. Those have to be predefined. But I can define a neural network that goes from those inputs to those outputs. And I can have, if I want, I can add layer. I could start out with a 1-layer neural network. And I can have as an option, add a layer to the neural network. Add feedback to make it a recurrent neural network, for example. So there's memory. Those things are possible. because you're working with the network, you're working within a very structured domain. So that, say, add layer is possible as an operator, make recurrent is possible as an operator. The problem usually with the neural networks then is coming up with a training algorithm for them. It's not so easy. That's why these kinds of these alternative approaches, where you have relatively simple control, and then you do the kinds of selection algorithms that Peter was pointing out are interesting. And you can do evolution even with control networks, with, say, in antimony, because you can write a Python script that adds chemical reactions to an antimony model, editing the string. So you can, not very pretty way. It's not very pretty, but it's not that bad to do it.
Right. I was actually thinking of that while you were teaching it, but it seemed like one of these other methods might be more straightforward.
So Connor did that as a class project.
With antimony.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But again, you have to decide what kinds of network options are going to allow. In other words, you can add node, add link, add regulatory signal, take out node. You have to write all of the topological transformations of the network that you're going to allow. And be careful. That's why you always scale your values between 0 and 1. And remember, I said some things about hill functions and scaling. Those are all designed to allow you to do that kind of thing, where your network will work, because the inputs are always going to be and outputs are always going to be compatible with each other, however you wire it up. I'd be happy to show you some of that. I'm not going to write the code to do the symbolic manipulation, but it's not terrible to do it. It's easier if you have a little parser, but you don't have to use a parser. You can do it by hand. It's not too bad. That's one of the nice things about antimony. The syntax is so simple. So you write an operator that adds elements and links. But you have to maintain lists pretty carefully. You have to know what your components are. Have to add component. You have to. It's a bit of work. It's not horrible, but it's a bit of work. But it'd be fun to have it done. You might find some. That's the kind of thing. This is something I talked about the very first day, and nobody's, as far as I know, has done it. Has anybody used ChatGPT to write code yet?
I've asked ChatGPT for help with little bits of code here and there.
I mean, for CompuCell code specifically.
Oh, no.
She lied. Did you try ChatGPT for CompuCell? No. It knows about steppable architecture, and it knows a lot of CompuCell functions. It knows things like for cell and self.cell list. It knows that.
I wonder if it knows about adhesion flex. That might be getting a little too deep.
It certainly knows the XML, the basic XML. So you might play with it. My experience is that it's pretty good at writing CompuCell code. Doesn't do everything you need, but it's not bad. It's worth playing with. That could be that could have been a good. Somebody could play with that and then do a breakout session next year explaining how it worked. So I think that could be actually quite useful.
I mean, that could be a hackathon project in itself, just pushing ChatGPT to its limits and seeing what it can and can't do.
In 5 years, we'll be writing CC3D code with plain English.
Well, it's interesting because TJ today was talking about replacing XML with pure Python, and somebody else was talking about kill XML, and I for a variety of reasons actually think that's completely wrong. I actually believe that we need to have XML to do everything. You can not that it has to be XML. In other words, Maciek and I got into this sometimes. XML is just a bunch of brackets that make it easier to parse things. There are plenty of formats that are standardized and shareable that are not XML. You don't need to have angle brackets to make a parsable syntax, modular syntax. But Python is not modular. It's intrinsically not modular, and it's not designed with a clean API. And so the key thing is not so much whether you write Python or something else. The key thing is to modularize your code with clean APIs. And TJ's done that. It showed you a bit how to do that today with Python, but it's very cumbersome to do it that way. And so to abstract concepts like cell cycle and say that these are the parameters that you're going to use, to abstract concepts like plotting and have those things. You wind up, if you work too hard, you wind up reinventing Python, which is the point of the people who want flexibility. But to be able to build modules that are interconnectable, Python is not great for that. Free coding in Python is not great for that. If you impose rules on top of your Python, it's possible. Yeah, Jason is, I mean, there are many, right? The great thing about standards is there's so many of them, right? So in the days when we still had offices and people came into work, Jim Sluka had a wonderful cartoon on his door, because Jim Sluka's work is in ISO, is in the International Standards Organization, and he developed standards. And the cartoon is there are 12 incompatible. The two people are talking. They say there are 12 incompatible standards, and they're all looking at the board, and they say we need one standard that encompasses all of them. And then you see the next panel of the cartoon is the same people looking at the board saying, now we have 13 incompatible standards. So, but Herbert Sauerow has a whole institute in Seattle at University of Washington, the Center for Reproducible Modeling. And he's the one who developed antimony and SPML. And so the key thing is that if you do have a standard for specifying, there really are no good standards for agent-based model specification. The closest thing we have to a standard for agent-based model specification is NetLogo, and which we don't use. And there are reasons for that. And we could go into the technical issues about why it's very hard to specify a method-independent specification for cell behaviors. But those are good topics of conversation. Again, these are the kinds of things where if we were in person, it would be nice because we could go have dinner and have these conversations over dinner. But they're interesting problems. So Pedro makes the comment that it would be greater to make everything 100% Python. If the entire world is going to use CompuCell and nothing else ever, then that's true. But in fact, you should be able to write a model specification and have it run in CompuCell or Chaste or Physicell or Morpheus. And that means you cannot use Python to specify the model. You have to have a language. You can compile the language into Python. That's not a problem. But the model specification cannot be in Python. It has to be parsable and interpretable, which Python is not. Physicists always go and write hard-coded things. They have no interest in anybody ever reusing their code. But it's incredibly wasteful. It's not scientific, fundamentally. That's a lesson you only learn That's a lesson you only learn the hard way by running into the problems it creates. All right, anything else? Hayden, Gilberto, Joel?
I'm okay.
I'm sorry, Julio's back there. I think there are more of us instructors left in the room than there are participants. So please don't be shy. And it's not, I'm not trying to be difficult to people. These are tough questions. And I have no problem if people kick back and disagree with what I say. I know people tend to think of somehow authority figures. It's not what it's about. But these are difficult issues to grapple with.
Well, for example, the I think your point on XML is a good point. So yeah, getting rid of XML wouldn't be the right move if you intend to specify your model structure as something translatable, right? But for example, using toEdit instead of a more sophisticated editor for Python, we are basically losing some powerful debugging capabilities offered by these other platforms, and we have to basically reinvent the wheel every time some new great idea is done by someone else in Python. So we basically are in a rush trying to keep up with new technologies coming from other people. So we are not exactly contributing to them, and they are not contributing to us. We are competing with them. So toEdit is a competitor, and the others are competitors. And the player, I mean, the player is fine because of the amount of effort put into it in the past years, the past decades, I think. But I'm not sure it was entirely necessary, because there are a bunch of extremely powerful visualization methods in Python. You can do videos automatically, and using Player, you have to edit your videos after you run the simulation, so it's painful. And I think we are missing out on many things, trying to focusing on a standalone software.
So you raised a lot of very important points and interesting points. They're and they go in a lot of different directions. So I think those are good things to think about. What I will tell you is this: today, nobody would invent Player. When Player was developed, there was nothing else. There was nothing else. There were no alternatives. And so to some extent, we're a prisoner of our history with Player. So if you did it, if you started clean today, you wouldn't use it. You wouldn't do it that way. But 20 years ago, there was no alternative. So that is how you did it. Sometimes being the first mover on something traps you with old technology, as you point out. That's a little bit different from the issue about model specification, which I think we can have a conversation about another time. They're sort of orthogonal to each other.
Yes, they are. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you still want to do parameter scan in the XML, over the parameter the parameter specification code.
Let me, I think people are tired, so let me cut this off a little bit. Let me be clear about something, because I think what I was talking about XML maybe wasn't clear enough. I was not necessarily saying that our XML is good. If I were going to write the XML again, it would look much more like what Paul is doing for VisiCell. And in fact, the Morpheus XML is better than the CompuCell XML. And I think Paul's VisiCell XML is better than either. And the reason for that is they've learned. In other words, the Morpheus people looked at CompuCell XML and asked the question, how could you make it better? And then they did. And Paul has looked at that and then modified it again. The big issue with the XML is that the CompuCell XML does not separate the specification, does not allow you to have cell types. It's structured by energy functions rather than by cells. One. And two, it's still specific to CompuCell implementation. It's still specific to Potts model representations. This is also like that. And that's a fundamental defect. And so what you need then is another language, which is a higher level language, which then compiles to a lower level language. And then that would then in turn compile to Python. If you look at really strong standards, like the ones for internet protocols, there may be 9 or 10 layers of different layers of abstraction between the hardware that implements the functionality, which goes to your wireless connection, and the API that the communication module sees. You don't do it in one step, but writing those layers is very time consuming. And for biology, the APIs are not so obvious. And so we can talk about the specific tools, and those are important and interesting to talk about as well. But I'm talking about model specification, which is a little bit different. And again, when I talk about XML, I don't mean that CompuCell XML is the way to go either. But I think going to Python as a model specification is exactly the wrong way to go. It's exactly the wrong thing to do. That doesn't mean that you can't do everything in Python at some point, but you have to have a way of specifying the models that's not dependent on a particular language. Okay, boy, so that you could have. We've had a series of workshops, and not for a long time, but we did 6 workshops on exactly that topic. 6 multi-day workshops, 2 of them in NIH headquarters, some of which had hundreds of people involved on this topic. It's a hard problem.